Welcome to the New Wealth Wave podcast hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. We're diving deep into the intricate layers of the 7-stage generational wealth model to offer invaluable insights on legacy building, wealth accumulation and preservation, and financial growth across generations. I'm Dr. Joaquin Wallace, and this is the New Wealth Wave podcast. Hey, future wealth builders, this is Dr. Joaquin Wallace, and welcome to another episode of the New Wealth Wave podcast. Today, we are focusing on stages 4 and 5 of the generational wealth model, and to help lead the discussion will be Louis Barajas. And before we get into letting him introduce himself, I'm going to give you some background on this man. I'm going to give him his flowers today because he is one of the best. His voice is large out here in this financial space. First and foremost, one of the first Latin CFPs in the U.S., currently on the national board of the CFPs, first Latino ever, currently starring on a national television series for PBS called Opportunity Knocks, named by Financial Planning Magazine as one of the 24 people who will shape wealth planning in 2024, named on the Billboard magazine top business managers list for the last 7 years in a row, author of 5 books with a 6th book on the way as well called The Go Better Entrepreneur coming out later this year, and also the CEO of the Registered Investors Advisory Firm, International Private Wealth Advisors. Louis, thank you for coming on the New Wealth Wave podcast.
Dr. Wallace, I appreciate you. I appreciate the work that you're doing. I think we're kindred spirits. We're just doing it on opposite sides of California. You're northern, I'm southern. And I think we've been doing this for a very long time. So I'm happy to be on your podcast.
I appreciate it. You know, I've been watching you from afar. I've watched some of your podcast episodes, and I said, got to get this guy on because, I mean, he's doing some positive work out in the community as well. And also, you know, I wanted to make sure that we also hear from the marginalized communities, the Black and brown communities as well. I think that's so important in this space in terms of financial literacy, what you call a financial mindset. We'll get to that as well. If this is your first time tapping into the New Wealth Wave podcast, it's based on my 7-stage generational wealth model. The model focuses on 3 phases of life: the past, the present, and the future. Let's talk about the 7 stages. Stage 1 is our internal and external ecosystem. Stage 2 is our financial genetic code. Stage 3 is financial healing, where we reprogram our financial genetic code, which is a byproduct of stages 2 and 1. Stage 4 is financial edification. We focus on financial literacy and inclusion. Stage 5 is financial well-being. This is where we're all trying to get to our soft landing. We have financial health. Stage 6 is generational knowledge. This is where we create our financial footprints to achieve stage 7, which is generational wealth. Now, Louis, you had a chance to take a look at the model. What was your initial thoughts?
It encompasses everything and all of my life's work that I've been doing, and I'm 1,000% agreement with it. I haven't had a chance to really spend some time with you to figure out how you work it, because from a practical experience now, I am doing your stage 5 with stage 1. I mean, I pretty much kind of started because I've learned my lesson that it takes a lot of time and sometimes can take years to change somebody's mindset, right? Especially because I'm dealing with communities that are underserved. So I grew up in a city called Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles back in the 60s and 70s that were pretty gang infested, very, very poor. Back then, I think 60% of all Latinos in that community were unbanked. I mean, didn't have a checking account or savings account. So talk about mindset, right? And so what I did is that now my experiment, almost 40 years later, 30 something years later, shows me that, I mean, I've got clients that started in the barrio, in the hood, making minimum wage, blue collar worker, immigrants who now have 800, 900, 1.2 million, 1.5 million invested with us, right? And have paid off their homes and have their estate planning done. But the key was getting them started on practical financial planning systems while we were working on the mindset. And it's all there for me, but I've learned to kind of work it just a little different probably. And again, maybe that's the way you work it as well, because sometimes it's not very linear, right? We're doing 2 or 3 things at the same time.
And that's an excellent answer, because you can go counterclockwise as well as clockwise. And again, we always going back and forth. What I always say to my clients is that it doesn't matter. You're always on one of those stages within the model itself. It may be 1, it may be 2, depending on where you're at. You may be on stage 5, that may be your present, but you have to go back to your past, which is what you have to deal with as well. So that's a great analogy as well. Now, before we get into the heavy lifting, I like to always ask a question to kind of lighten the mood. So tell us a fun fact about yourself.
Fun fact. Okay, so I'm the biggest jokester you've ever met. The problem is that now I'm like 62, right? Going on 63 this year. And I'm the OG when it comes to like I'm on the National Certified Financial Planning Board. I'd speak across the country. And so everybody comes to me and they're very serious. And I love to kid around. And probably everybody who is my close inner circle knows that half the time I'm probably kidding around. Right. I mean, that's it. The other thing is a fun fact. I got on the first minority ever on the national board of the FPA. That was in 2004. Not first Latino Black, but the first minority ever. And I had never played golf because where I grew up, we used golf clubs as weapons. We didn't use golf clubs to play golf. So I didn't take up golf until I was 45 years old because I was so intimidated to go on a golf course. I didn't know any better. I mean, I grew up in Boyle Heights. So that's a fun fact. I'm not a big avid golfer now, but I'd love to play golf, but I didn't take it up till way late in life.
It's same to me. I just started picking up golf a few years ago as well. So because that's something I wasn't familiar with, I was an athlete, but I never really understood and had even liked golf. But now that's, I find myself at a driving range on a regular occasion now. So once we get into the model itself, I always start with a 3-part question. So the first part of the question is, before becoming an advocate in this financial literacy and educational space, which stage were you on in the model?
I'll tell you my story, but I'll quickly jump ahead and tell you where I was. I mean, I was on stage 1, right? Because I didn't know any better. I was really put into a situation to help my parents because I was the eldest of 3 kids that spoke English and did well in school. When I was 11, my dad lost 2 jobs and he started his own ornamental iron business where they make wrought iron window guards and doors and fences. And I had to help my dad with filling out business applications and at one point even preparing his own tax return at the age of 13. But I had no clue. And looking back now, I can realize, boy, it was the mindset of our family. We didn't know any better. Forget about financial literacy. We had no idea that we can even get out of the barrio, to be quite honest with you.
So my second question is, basically, you started in financial planning, you left the industry and started working with multimillionaires and billionaires at a major consulting firm. What was your aha moment?
1971, 72, my dad loses 2 jobs. I'm 11 years old, have to fill out an application for my dad's business. At the age of 13, the IRS officer went to my dad's shop where my dad was welding and I was there sweeping the floors. And this IRS agent said, "Mr. Barajas, you haven't filed tax returns." And my dad and I looked at the lady and we said, like, "What are those?" She said, "Business tax returns." And the way I made it out of the barrio, Dr. Wallace, was that I was raised by my grandmother because my mom got pregnant with me at the age of 15. And I was also raised, who was always there, was my uncle, who could have been a professor in Mexico, but was a meat cutter in East Los Angeles. Loved books. And so he got me focused on books since I was like 9 years old. So I asked the IRS agent, "Is there a book on how to prepare a tax return?" Because in the community that I grew up in, there were no bookstores, but my dad would drive me like 13 miles and I bought a book on how to file tax returns and I started. So to be quite honest with you, we got audited for that tax return a couple of years later. And I told my dad, my aha moment was, "Dad, if I'm going to help you with your businesses, I have to go to business school or I have to go to college." And so we went through college. And then in college, I met somebody at UCLA who was starting to do financial planning, was working for, back then was IDS. And then it became IDS American Express, is now Ameriprise. And then I got involved in, when I was getting my master's at Claremont Graduate School, I became a financial planner. And I hated it, Dr. Wallace. It was basically sales. It was, you could sell vacuum cleaners or you could sell mutual funds back then. And I was trying to work with the community of the people. And I was taught in financial planning that we should build a budget. We should build an emergency reserve. And emergency reserves, the dollars need to be liquid. And I had back then 60% of community that I grew up in were unbanked. They did not use the bank for savings or checking. Everything was in cash. So what happened was I started helping clients open up bank accounts and saving there. And then I had a meeting with my manager at Ameriprise that said, "Hey, listen, you're not going to make it here because you got to put sales together and you got to do what's best for you and the client," which is like, why don't you open up an annuity and put it into the fixed side? And that way you make money and the client does okay. And I felt that that was the correct. So I left the industry and I said, I will never go into wealth management, financial planner, because I'm not about selling just products. I'm about helping clients. So I left very disgruntled, finishing up the CFP back then. And I ended up just by chance working at a firm called Kenneth Leventhal out of Newport Beach, California. And because I was already in financial planning, and back then CPAs could not sell any products, they were the trusted advisor. They asked me if I could start doing financial planning for some of the wealthiest people in the world. And most of our clients were real estate developers. And I started doing financial planning where they were charging, this is a 1986, 87, 88, somewhere around there. They were charging $15,000 to $25,000 for a financial plan, which was a lot of money. And I always had these high hopes. I said, this is what I wanted to do with my community, but they didn't have the money to do that. And I didn't see any other way out. So what happens and was my epiphany? In 1990, my grandmother, who raised me, the love of my life, 4'8" little lady, ends up dying from complications of a heart attack. I'm heartbroken. I do her eulogy. 2 weeks later, my uncle, her eldest son, who used to buy me books, who got me out of the barrio, commits suicide. And a couple of weeks after that, my daughter is born at Hoag Hospital in Newport Beach. And I'm working on some really high profile cases at the time. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. My wife called me. She said she's driven herself to the hospital. I take a flight from Phoenix and take a taxi to the hospital. My daughter's fine. She's born on a Saturday morning. I think it's 4:00 in the morning. My wife asked me if I can go to the house and pick up some supplies for her for the hospital. Hadn't eaten, hadn't changed. So go home, shower, change. And I stop off at a coffee shop. And this is where my life changes. A coffee shop in Lake Forest, California, around 7:00 in the morning, 6 to 7. I was so hungry. I was putting cream cheese on a bagel so I can just get it and go in the car and leave and go back to the hospital, getting my cup of coffee. And some gentleman comes and he's asked if he can sit right next to me. And I said, listen, wait like 10 seconds. I'm almost done putting the cream cheese on my bagel. Sit in my chair. My chair has a cushion. You'll be more comfortable. But while I'm putting cream cheese on the bagel, I'm thinking about how my daughter that I had just held a few hours earlier was never going to meet my grandmother or my uncle outside of my parents, the people that influenced me the most. He thought that something was wrong with my daughter. So he asked me some questions and I hadn't slept. I hadn't eaten. I was very vulnerable, told him all the stuff that was going on and saying that, my uncle had committed suicide. My grandmother had died. My daughter had been born hours earlier. And this gentleman started to have a conversation. I don't remember if it was a 30-minute conversation, 45 minutes, or an hour and a half. Long story short, I head back to the hospital. I tell my dad, I met a gentleman at a coffee shop that just changed my life. I'm quitting my job at Leventhal on Monday, and I'm going to head back to East LA to help the poor. And my dad says, wow, for the first time ever, above his shop, there was a restaurant side of it. And above it were 2 apartments that had been occupied for over a decade. And he goes, for the first time in a decade, he goes, those apartments are empty. Why don't you come back? We'll convert them into your offices. You don't have to pay me rent until you start getting clients. And my dad wanted me close to him because I'd always been doing his taxes and financial planning and everything for him. But he didn't know exactly what happened. Well, the epiphany was I now go back to East LA to help the poor because back in 1990, 91, remember, there was no internet, or it was just barely starting. There was really no internet, and there was no financial literacy. There were no books on financial literacy. Remember that I had already gone through the Denver College of Financial Planning. I had a degree from UCLA. I had an MBA in finance from Claremont Graduate School, and I'd been working with some of the wealthiest people in the world doing financial planning, multimillionaires and billionaires. And I'm thinking, I'm going to go change this community. Nobody shows up. It's crickets. And then I start talking to the clients and start bringing them in. I start doing tax returns, which I didn't want to do, but to bring them in so I can talk to them about financial planning. I realized, holy moly, no amount of financial literacy is going to help this community because their mindset is in the way of them, even for me to get them to really read anything on financial literacy or accept that they can become financially wealthy. So I ended up writing a book that got published by HarperCollins called The Latino Journey to Financial Greatness, which is still out. I had its 20th anniversary edition just out recently. And it talks about the financial mindset of Latinos. And my goal then became in the barrio was, I know I can't, but if I could change the mindset so then they can get excited about reading books. Back then it was Dave Ramsey and Susie Orman and who was publishing books and my friend David Bach. And I said, so I need to prepare them to acknowledge that financial literacy will work for them. And I ended up writing one book, and then I wrote another book called My Street Money, and then Small Business, Big Life for women, overworked, overwhelmed, and underpaid. And now the new book that's coming out this year is The Go Better Entrepreneur. But it's always been on people of color who come from nothing, who once they make money, they sabotage themselves and end up being poor again. And so I've seen it many, many times. And now I'm fortunate enough that I've broken through where my clients are still from the barrio, but I am now managing some of the most iconic Latin artists and also baseball players in the US. I got 16-year-old kids making $2-3 million, Dr. Wallace, parents were apple pickers. And so they don't know what to do with their money. And so I've seen them make money, but I've also seen them sabotage themselves and lose everything. And the only visual, and then I'll let you ask me the next question, but the only visual that I always give to people, I said, imagine that you are this building that's on a 6-inch foundation, and a small building, but you want to grow and you want to be a second story and a third story. And then you want to be what we call in Spanish, a rascacielos, a skyscraper. You want to grow. I said, if your foundation isn't deep, you're going to collapse at some point. And so my goal is to make your foundation deeper and change the money beliefs and change the way you think about scarcity and how you're going to end up sabotaging yourself. That was the epiphany of how I went from that stage one, which is the most important stage, which requires a tremendous amount of effort and time and conversation to really understand and get to know the client.
I'm glad that you touched upon that. I mean, let's talk about your education as well. You have an MBA, EA, CFP, AIF, and CEPA. So, I mean, you're well-rounded, which is awesome. But, you brought a humanistic point to it as well. And oftentimes, I love how you correlated how in some instances, it's all about making money in the financial industry, so to speak. But for the most part, it's important that you have to be able to be where the client is at that time. And oftentimes, we miss the boat. Well, I don't, and you don't, but many people miss the boat trying to place their expectations with how they view where they're supposed to be on those clients. And it just doesn't work because it gives them unrealistic expectations.
So what you're saying right on the point, and let me just share with you. So when I first met parents who were inspired by my background, when I went back to East LA, they said, we want our kids to go to college, right? And so if you're talking to most financial planners, they're going to say, well, which college, how much time do they have left? Let me find out which 529 plan, whether we're going to go passive or active, yada, yada, yada. We were going back and getting the report cards, asking for report cards from their parents, from the kids, to see if they were C students, D students, A students. We were having them take self-esteem courses. There was an organization in East LA called Telecu that used to have a self-esteem course that we would send them through to see where they were. We would get letters from their math teacher and English teacher to see where they were at. Because let me just share with you, one of the critical things is that I needed to know if we were going to save money for college, that we were doing all the things that were going to get the child into college, but to graduate from college. Because back in East LA, remember, there was two high schools, Roosevelt High School and Garfield High School. They had a 50-something% dropout rate, which didn't include the dropout rate from prior to going into high school. And then the ones that did go, they went to the local community college. There was the East Los Angeles College, and only 3% would ever graduate into a 4-year university. And so the thing is that I said, are you involved? Do you go to parent-teacher night? Do you know your kid's level of self-esteem? Are you aware of what the report card is and what their grades are? Because if they're getting D's, instead of doing a 529 plan, let's hire a kid a tutor. Let's hire a kid a coach. If you're having financial problems, instead of putting money away in a mutual fund or in a 529 plan, let's hire a family counselor, a therapist to work with you. Because that's going to give your kids a better shot of graduating from college. Because when I would ask the parents and the mothers who would tell me in Spanish, yo no más quiero que se defenda mi niño. I just want to know that if I die, that my kids can defend themselves in this world. And I know that if I get them an education, they can't take that away. I said, so let's do everything possible and spend money that will give us the biggest impact from your kid to graduate from college. And I will share with you, 529 plans weren't in at the time, but there were UGMA accounts, and all that. And we wouldn't open up any account. We would get them into family counseling, or we would get them tutors, or we would get them going to the Telecu weekend course on self-esteem where kids would climb poles or get them to travel outside of their community. Money is just a tool to live a better quality of life. And the thing is that our industry has taught us that a product is a solution. And sometimes, again, at the end of the day, we have to use money for its highest and best use. Same thing, we ask our clients on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your marriage? I ask everybody. And if I don't get a 9 or a 10, we use some of that money to go to marriage counseling, believe it or not. Money that was going to go into 401k, because otherwise I'm saving the money for the future to go into a divorce attorney. That's why when I saw your model, I said, this is exactly what I'm working. This is what works. And I know that we have to just use money as the highest and best source. And that's why when we go back to it, at some point we'll talk about it. But I think the industry has failed, at least communities of color.
And, I love how you're talking about self-esteem, because if you break it down to Maslow's 5 hierarchy of needs, we talk about the top is self-actualization, bottom is physiological, safety, social, and self-esteem. And we all know that that's so important. And I love how you focus on the parents. I'm the same way. I really focus on the parents. We had a welfare to work program some time ago, and that's exactly what we did. We looked at Maslow's 5 hierarchy of needs. We came with a model and a plan. You have to include the parents. Because my argument is, and I'm sure you can kind of echo the same thing, is that regardless of what we do to the kids, that is great. But at the end of the day, the kid has to go home. If the environment is not stable, if it's dysfunctional, then whatever we're doing with the kid, on our end it's really not going to be as effective because the kid has to go home into an environment where oftentimes the parents are envious of their success because they're not where they need to be. I mean, that's a fascinating point. I really do believe in that. And so when I look at the model, I know we're getting ahead of ourselves. Look at the model itself. When we look at stage one, the internal and external ecosystem, when we talk about walls in, you talk about is self-sabotage, learned helplessness. All of those things are in place within that stage one of the model. That's internally. Then we walk outside the door. Then we have to deal with the external side, social economics, healthcare, education, environment. All of those play a huge factor. And that's why, in regards to what you and I do, it's important that we have to go back and understand the person. We have to understand the person first before we begin to give solutions to a problem. I do believe there's several stages within the stages. Not everybody is ready for a financial planner. Not everyone is ready for a financial advisor.
Yeah, I'm looking at your model, right? And even on stage 6, I've taken people all the way through stage 6, and we got some clients right now on stage 7. But at stage 6, I've seen where they have sabotaged themselves. We're going through all the stages of success, right? All your stages of success, and say that generational knowledge where they're not teaching it. And then they end up doing something stupid because what happened was they go back to stage 1 where there was something there was a certain mindset that was never, it was just tucked away in the corner, put underneath the mattress or whatever, or underneath the rug. And it was really dealt with. And that mindset caused that trauma, which brought back that memory, which screwed up everything that they've done to be successful. I'll share with you that I've had clients that have earned $17 million in 1 year. I saw one client blow through 16 million of that in 1 year. And we went back and it was that stage 1, stage 2. And even though we've been working with him for a decade, he went back and he just reverted back to the old way of being. So I think that this model is fantastic. And I think some clients are more than one stage or 2 stages. I think sometimes they're in 3 stages, to be quite honest with you.
Well, as I said earlier, it's one of those that you could be doing 1, 2, and 3 at the same time. You could be going clockwise and counterclockwise. You can be jumping back and forth. It depends on when you're at and where your mindset is at. So with that being said, I mean, looking at where you started, and where are you currently located on the model?
Realistically, I'm on stage 6 completed because I have an estate plan. I could retire. I could make work optional at this point in my life, which is fantastic. I love the work that I do so much. I'm going to probably do it to the very end. But at this point, I can make work optional. I'm now sitting down with my wife and saying, we have 3 grown children and we have 8 grandchildren. What would be the most ideal way to transfer our wealth to our children to have them create the greatest impact without entitling them, without making them lazy, with them understanding, and how can they use some of that money to also help their children? So my wife and right now, we're kind of on that stage 7 where we're having deep thoughts. And I want to share with you one tool that I use, and it's right here next to my desk that I always carry, but it's this empty box here, and it's a puzzle box. And so right now, my wife and I, so in this puzzle box, we have all these pieces of puzzles, our estate plan, our businesses. I've got 4 companies on my books and speaking and everything else. And so, the goal that you have on stage 1 and stage 2 and stage 3 is, how do we paint the picture on this puzzle box so that we know what we want to do by the time we're all said and done? What are we doing now? How are we putting all these pieces to really provide generational wealth? So I'm on this really fact finding. I'm reading books and books and books right now of a lot of financial coaches that are thought beyond how do you leave money to really impact. And I can share with you, and probably the same thing with you, when you've had clients pass away and have left money to the children, that it ends up being a mess because they never thought it through. They didn't take each child independently and thought about what would hurt them or help them, which is a huge, I think right now, gap when it comes to estate planning. Nobody's having deeper conversations of how can you take that money that you're going to leave to the next generation and really create a positive impact versus a negative. I've got families that their kids don't even talk to each other anymore after the parents passed because, they did terrible job at constructing their trusts.
It's interesting. First and foremost, I want to thank you again for coming on. This is a fascinating conversation. Future Wealth Builders, make sure you subscribe to New Wealth Wave podcast. Mr. Barajas he's been excellent so far. Some great dynamic conversations. We may have to have you come back for part 2 because I'm sure we're going to run out of time here. So I'm letting you know, I'm putting on the books right now. I really love how you describe this. I'm from the same ilk as you on this particular topic. So why do you write books about financial mindset instead of financial literacy? Fascinated to hear your answer to that because I think we're talking the same thing here.
I started working with clients for the longest time, and I started realizing that they were sabotaging their success, or when they got to a point where I had a lot of people that came out of the barrio that ended up going to college and became successful lawyers, doctors, nurses, they would sabotage. It's almost like even though we had taken the person out of the barrio, we hadn't taken the barrio out of that person. Even though, like I said, they're now highly educated, but they really haven't changed. They have the same money stories that nobody's had a conversation. I mean, that wasn't even a topic that somebody would bring up. And so I realized that they were making a couple $100,000 a year, Dr. Wallace, and they were still borrowing from their immigrant parents who were blue collar workers. They were borrowing money from them. And I'm thinking, how could that be? And I realized I got to take a step back. Financial literacy, these are people are literate. They've read books on financial planning. They knew who, Susie Orman was. They knew who Dave Ramsey was, and they were still poor. They were still financially poor, spiritually poor, emotionally poor, but they had worked so hard to make it out of that lower income, social mindset to now they were successful. They were upper middle, upper class, but they were still thinking from a poverty perspective. And I realized, man, no amount of financial literacy is going to help this person. We need to work on their financial mindset, right? That was the biggest thing. That was my epiphany.
And that's so interesting because, how I got into this space as well, because the model is basically me being transparent with myself and the clients I've met over the years. I'm a firm believer. I'll stand on my soapbox here. Financial literacy is a small piece to the puzzle, as you mentioned earlier. And how we're looking at it is that you hear these buzzwords now, financial literacy and generational wealth. That's all you hear nowadays. That's like the buzzword. It's sexy. This is what they're funding. Companies are funding this. They're getting behind this. But at the end of the day, financial literacy, the way they're describing it, is a linear model. It's not linear. It's holistic. And so, like you said earlier, you're not really solving the problem. Yes, I can read a book. Yes, I've made it financially. Yes, my stage 4 in terms of financial inclusion is important. I've been able to get there. Stage 5, financial well-being, I'm there as well. But at the end of the day, it's not a linear process. So it's a perpetual cycle. It's continued on and on and on and on. And with that being said, you have a lot of clients who come to you or I and say, well, I need a financial advisor. There's a difference between a financial advisor and a financial planner. They're two different people. And it's also, you have to have a financial educator, a financial counselor, right? Financial advising, financial planning. I mean, I think those are the stages that you really go to. And then eventually you can get to the financial planning side. I want to ask you this question because you touched on it. You talk about when you meet the parents and a couple of questions you asked, they don't have a 9 or 10 in terms of their marriage, their union. I firmly believe, based on the model itself, is that when you have two different people coming from two different ecosystems, stage 1, it definitely affects their ability to be in marriage because we know that a lot of divorces are based around money. So with that being said, do you believe that should be a very important piece in regards to before you get married? So you have your counseling and things of that nature. Those issues need to be handled first, because as you know, once you become married, you're now one union, and then you have all these issues stemming up from stages 1.
1000% agree with you. One of the questions that I have when I onboard a client, I'm having my initial meetings, maybe the first or second meeting, I will look them in the face and I said, is there an elephant in the room that you guys are not going to discuss with me because if you bring it up, you're going to end up in a fight? An elephant in the room that has to do with your finances. For example, one of the spouses still helps out their family members or their parents and they give them a lot of money and the other person doesn't know it, or they know it sometimes, or, and every time they bring it up, they fight. Because normally a couple will at some point put that issue under the rug, becomes an elephant in the room. They don't want to discuss it. They end up in a fight. And so I don't know if they're in denial about it, but they're just tolerating it until they can't tolerate it anymore. Until things start breaking down, then those tolerations become huge fights. And so I can share with you that 100% of the time, there's always an elephant in the room. There's some topic and where I become the mediator. So I said, listen, we're not judging here. I just need to hear your point. I need you to hear your point. I'm not here to tell you who's right or wrong, because you're both right and you're both wrong. I said, but I need to hear what's going on because I know that that's going to sabotage you from some kind of financial success down the future. So let's talk about it. And I agree with you. There's this whole concept of financial therapy, right? There's now a financial therapy association. I was at their last national meeting. Like I said, I'm so glad because I'm not a financial therapist, but I was talking to a financial therapist and I said, God, you would make an ideal strategic partner or coming in as a partner with us at our firm, to be on staffs because everybody needs at least some financial therapy about something. And so I 1000% agree with you. Yeah.
Now let's really get into that topic more. So who does it affect? Well, it affects your kids, because when you look at it, your kids, this is what you see as you grow up. You see your parents fighting. You see all this happening. And then at the end of the day, a lot of that trauma that you experience, it comes from that, because it's generationally willed to us. And I always say that, we don't know what's happening to us as we're growing up. But at the end of the day, this is generationally willed upon us. And we have to some kind of way move away from that. But it's so hard to do because we're kids, we're carrying that on. And oftentimes you got to break that cycle some kind of way.
Yeah, well, no, let me just share with you, like I told you that I also handle now as a business manager. I work with some professional athletes, and I do work with mostly musicians. I will notice that when they're very young and very successful at an early age, like I think I mentioned that I've got a 16-year-old that's making a couple million a year. There's an entourage of the people around them, and then they become so successful that they feel guilty, not only not helping their family, but now they feel almost like obligated to help their entourage, and that entourage just sticks to them for their whole career. And then that career ends early if they're an athlete, and their entourage is going to be, they've never had anything. Now they just kind of, sucked everything out of my client, but my client doesn't have any money left because they've been paying for everything. And so again, those are things that when you sit there and you start having those conversations with that athlete or that entertainer, and you're starting talking about the entourage right away hates you because you're putting stuff in their ears saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't be paying for everything. Maybe. And now all of a sudden they're telling our clients, you got to get rid of Louis. I don't think he's that good. He doesn't understand because I'm already stopping that person from that. All these things that come into communities of poverty, right? Where we're also kind of feel obligated to help back. So we always talk about the sandwich generation, in which we have like parents who are helping out their teens or in college, and then they're still helping out their parents. At least from working with Latinos, it's always, I call it the club sandwich generation. There's another layer. They're also helping out their nieces or their friends, and money's just being sucked out. And so I've got to get them educated from not a literacy standpoint, from a mindset standpoint of that they've got to put that oxygen mask on first. They've got to take care of themselves so they can help other people. Or we have to use money if we're going to help other people. Instead of giving it away, show them how to use the money that they're giving to them. And again, all this comes from what we talk about, all that money mindset and behaviors, but also very cultural, right? There's cultural things that go on within our communities that only a person like you and I can bring up.
Absolutely. What are some of the biggest obstacles in the financial planning industry that prevent the underserved from achieving financial independence and generational wealth?
All right. This is like a big deal for me, because one of my goals is I want to give the opportunity to a lot of young Black and brown kids in high school to learn about our work that we do and how impactful it is and how we can build a career out of this. And so my goal is to try to bring as many Black and brown kids, and also to get them to become CFPs, certified financial planners. And right now, less than 5%, 4 point something CFPs are Latinos and Blacks, less than 5%, somewhere in the 4.2 something. So our goal is to bring them in. But what happens is when we bring these kids into the industry and they want to work in their communities where there's not a lot of money, it seems like the insurance companies pick them up, or certain investments come pick them up, and then they train them, and they really do believe they're helping their community out by selling their grandmother or their parents, like, for example, annuities, versus putting them in a no-load kind of ETF, whatever, fund, and they train them. And so they think that they're doing well to help their communities when they're not. And so it's this goal of that the financial planning industry right now is really meant to only help, I believe, the top 10% of income earning people or wealthy people in America, and 90% go 90 down. And I say that there's a lot of financial planners working from anywhere from the 70 to 90 income earners or wealth builders in America, where there's nobody really helping anybody from the 70 down. And the ones that are helping the people in 70 down, it's all product driven. The financial industry, to survive with these type of clients, must sell a high commission or a high something product like an annuity, a cash value life insurance policy when they really just need a term sometimes. And I do believe in cash value policies, but not for people that are poor and need actual insurance at the lowest cost. So I think that the industry hasn't figured out how to provide access to people, financial planning to people in communities where they're underserved, but competent, transparent, ethical advice. And I know for a fact that people are willing to pay for it, but don't sell them a product that is not going to help them, or they're going to start an insurance product that they're probably going to pay for the next couple of years and then have to cancel it and then not have any cash in there. And it was the worst thing that you probably could have done for them long term. The industry still works with people that are underserved from a very short time frame, and how quickly you can create some kind of profit versus how do you build them, how do you create wealth, and then how do you continue to grow that. So that's my take on the industry right now.
I love how you broke that down. And I always go back to the IULs. I mean, you hear a lot of IULs. And someone asked me a question. They said, why do you think there's so many people that sell IULs? They push the IUL product. I said, well, okay, I firmly believe, now I may not be wrong, I don't have the numbers to this, but I do believe why IULs are important, because it's a fixed product, for one, and you just need a regular insurance license. So if I have a regular insurance license and I'm trying to create a product in terms of cash value, as you mentioned earlier, save money, do what you need to do, I'm going to suggest an IUL because it's a fixed product. I don't have my 663 or 65, so I don't have that. So I can't get into the variables. I can't get into more elaborate products that are out there. And so what happens, I love how you mentioned that oftentimes we are selling these products to the marginalized communities. And at the end of the day, they pay for them for 2 to 3 years, and they're not able to continue to pay. They're not able to get their cash value that they was promised to get. And they're also miseducated because they don't understand the fact that you have to overfund those as well. And it's based upon your medical record as well, right? Because your medical is going to determine, what your MIP is, how much insurance you're paying. And if I'm paying the minimum amount, it's very unlikely, right, that I'm going to grow the cash value in a 2 to 3 year period simply because I'm not able to overfund it. But those are coming from those individuals, as you mentioned earlier. I love how I love you kind of led me somewhere. You see that you touched a button for me there.
Yeah, I always call it like I see it. I've had internal conversations. If you could be a fly on the wall, right? And I've had conversations with people from Pacific Life and Allianz or whatever. And I said, hey, listen, your product better than anyone inside and out. I said, if you were going to sell this to a family member, what's the minimum that you would tell a client that they should be putting in annually, or don't even touch an IUL, which is an index universal life insurance product? Almost everybody says, 9-10 grand, man, if the expenses are too high. And not a lot of families are putting $9,000-$10,000 a year every single year in the life insurance product when they really don't need $250,000 of coverage, where they need $1.5 million of coverage, where they can buy a term product for $30 a month. Right? I get it. We use IULs for really wealthy people. We're doing irrevocable life insurance trusts. We need cash value policies. We fund them through that. There are people who are making millions sometimes, making lots of money. But at the end of the day, when you say what's stopping our communities from achieving wealth, the other thing is that when somebody puts them into some kind of investment, whether through its Fidelity or Schwab, they don't properly educate them on what volatility is when it's done. Because I've seen so many people who I've tried to convince them to start investing for the long term in an S&P 500 fund or some kind of fund. And they had such a bad experience in 2020 or 2008 or whatever, when they invested. They had such a bad experience, or they put money in, they put in $1,000 and then now it got down to $700 or $900, and they got out and said, oh, I could lose money. Well, you did lose money because you got out, but nobody explained to them how investments work long term. And so they get this bad taste in their mouth and they never want to invest again. Now I've got to sit there and educate them, but then I've got to go through the trauma where they said, $1,000 was all their money they had. Now they say $900 in their next statement, and they're saying, I could have left it in the bank earning 1% and still made more money. But they don't understand how it works. And so now I've got to spend literally sometimes 1 or 2 years trying to get them to convince them to put money in and educate them. But because they've gone through that trauma where they've lost money, they say, right, it's worse for you if you lose money instead of made money, right? You feel it more emotionally. And that's where in the industry, when young people are helping other young people invest, they don't have the experience of what it's like to go through a recession. You and I have been through several recessions. We've been through a lot. And we've seen what money does, right? And we've always said, hey, when money's down, I get them ready to say, put more money in, right? When money's down, put more money in. And let me explain to you why. And sometimes we may be down 3 years. The S&P may be down 3 years in a row. And those 3 years, we've got to be investing heavily, because let me show you what happens after that. I'll tell them, hey, listen, the first year you put money $1,000 in, it's now $800. Do you leave Louis? You say, boy, that Louis doesn't know what the hell he's doing. Poor guy. He thinks he's smart, but he's not smart. And then I convince you to stay in. And the second year, instead of $800, you're now down to $750. You're going to say, that Louis doesn't know what he's doing. I'm down 2 years. I'm going to pull my money out. And some people might have waited to the third year with me, but they would have pulled out after 2 years of losing money with Louis Barajas in their Fidelity account where he put them in SPY or QQQ. And now those were the years where we should have put money. Now I show them a graph, and the graph I said, okay, where do you think would have been the best time to invest? And they said down here. Well, that was the Great Depression. What was the next time? Oh, that was the Great Recession in 2008. When was the next time? Well, look, in 2020, that's when you got out. I need you to understand. And so what happens is there's a lot of education, there's a lot of storytelling, there's a lot of, that's why I'm saying when I look at the model, I see people that say, well, I got some people in all these stages at one point, but the goal is that we need to figure out a way. I know we can't, but if we could, how do we get more people invested thinking long-term? And then what happens in 2020, Dr. Wallace, we get Robinhood, everybody starts investing in these fintech apps. I've got family members who are in their 20s and 30s who are now doing calls and puts and options, and they've never even invested a dime in a savings account. And they all lost, by the way. Some of them lost as much as $10,000 lost it all. And now, again, they have a bad taste in their mouth because they were gambling. They were not investing. And so the thing is that our communities need so much, but they also need somebody to kind of smack them on the head and say, come on, wake up. Because again, I go back to, we have all these old habits of we're poor. If we're going to make money, we got to gamble it or we got to make money fast. And then we've got right now, what you and I probably have to deal with is all these young TikTokers who had a credit card where they were owing 10, 15, 20,000 on a credit card, paid it down. And now they are giving financial advice on everything, including buying stocks, but they have no education. They have no experience. They have no knowledge. But right now I get clients sending me TikToks. Well, this guy said this, and I go, oh my God, now I got to sit there and explain why the TikTok is off, why that message is off. So our communities need a lot of work. We need to bring in a bigger army, and we got to educate that army as well.
Yeah, you definitely have to have a servant leadership type of mentality when you're going in, because you have to build that trust as well. We talk about it all the time. One thing I can say is that, we're in a position now, you and I, we're seeing it, is that at one point talking finance was taboo. No one was talking finance. Now we have people talking finance, and that shows you how we're starving for the information. Now, it may not all be true, but we're starving for that information because now we want to do this. We don't want to be, the younger generation doesn't want to be like their parents or their grandparents, so they're being very active. They're doing the things that they believe, but it's that microwave mentality, as you mentioned, is that we want to get it today, not understanding that it's a long haul, right? This may not be sexy, right, but it works, right? And so when you look at the three phases of the financial planning, right, you have the accumulation phase from 28 to 45, and from 45 to 60, you have the preservation of capital phase. Then you have from 60 on the gifting phase. And when you're meeting with your clients, you're trying to say, okay, this is exactly where you're at. But we have to mirror that, right, along with the model, but being in your position. I have to look at it from your lens. And that's where we miss the boat, because we always try to do things where we see what we want them to see versus how it really should be.
Right. I mean, I'm in agreement with you 100%. My goal is I don't plan to retire because I love what I'm doing so much right now. Like I said, I've gotten to the point where I'm kind of making work optional, but I love that I can still have a little bit of influence on some of the younger people that are getting in the industry. But there's just so much work. And then, like I said, your model is basically 100% encompassing everything that's got to get done. And what it's doing, it's making someone more conscious or self-aware or being in the now to realize, oh, shoot, you're right. I'm working on this, but I forget that I'm so busy that I did not go to stage one, or I kind of sort of skipped stage one. Or you know what? I will share with you, Doctor, as much as this model is so beautiful and everything's laid out, because that's not who they are, and they'll skip it. I can get more women. I get probably 95% of women to talk about stages 1 and stage 2, where it's a little tougher for men. It depends on how tough they are, how tough they think they are, to get them to talk about, their vulnerabilities, their fears, where I'm dealing with people from the hood have to be brave and strong. And and so it's harder for us to have those conversations with people like that. So, you and I got to get together. We got to spend some time together sharing. I've got also hundreds of pages of coaching stuff, but there's a lot of stuff that I think that both you and I resonate with because we've seen it in our communities.
Well, this definitely is not our last conversation. Trust on that. I'm standing on business, as they say, in regards to that. So a couple of final questions for you. We talked about literacy and your mindset. So financial literacy is challenging. We know that. So how do you break down their fears and trust to move forward and create wealth for the next generation?
I break it down by being vulnerable, by sharing stories of clients without naming the clients. I'm being transparent myself. I'm being authentic. I've been doing this for 40 years and people will ask me a question and I say, I don't know the answer. And I go, I'm the librarian, not the library. I know where to get the answer, but I don't know. What do you mean you don't know it? And I don't try to lie to them or act like I know something. So like I'm more important than I really think than I really am. It's to gain their trust. And at all levels, like I said, I've worked 35 years to be as transparent, to be as honest. I'm vulnerable with my clients, just as I expect that from them. And I believe that if you screw up once, if you take one penny from a client and you blow that trust, you've blown the relationship. Because at the end of the day, we're just dealing with souls, and souls are people here on earth, and everybody's struggling. And, I know that people say, well, they're really rich. And all my clients started from poverty. Every single client I have started from poverty. Oh, but the rich don't know what the poor people go through. No. They do they know what the poor, but what happens is they change and they forget what it is to be poor sometimes. But they're all going through some problem. They're all going through some struggle. So we think that wealthy people know it all. I've got some wealthy people, when I talk to them about their finances, they drown in a glass of water. So the thing is that you have to meet people where they're at. You have to understand that they're just souls trying to do the best that they can. Some people got lucky and made a lot of money, but that doesn't mean that their foundation is strong and their foundation still may be weak. So I try to build trust, Dr. Wallace. And again, trust has a lot of different levels. And again, I go back, transparency, being vulnerable, being honest, never lying, and not telling people that you know everything. When people tell me, well, how much money do you think you can make me on my money? I go, I have no idea. I said, I can tell you what it looks like and what we can do in the future. But what do you mean you don't know? And I said, what's the interest rate I'm going to get on my stock? And I go, well, first of all, you don't earn interest on your stock. I mean, you can get a dividend, but the point is you don't earn interest. And I have to explain to them and educate them because they don't understand. So it's more of educating and transparency, but that's how you get them to really focus on the financial literacy and trusting you on some of the advice that you're giving them.
So with that said, how will California's new bill, AB 2927, which mandates a semester-long personal finance education course for all high school students by the 27-28 school year, and make it a graduation requirement by the 2030-31 class, impact students and educators?
Well, I think you're talking about a brand new bill that just passed, right? I will wait to see what the content of the material that they're going to teach. And the reason is that sometimes it depends on the community, but in my community, in our community where there's a lot of poverty or people who are just kind of living paycheck to paycheck, sometimes certain financial literacy, almost without being conscious of it, keeps people down or keeps people poor. I love to work with people on figuring out how they can make more money on what they're earning, their potential, their human asset. And instead of sitting down there and doing a budget, because, there's this myth that if you're rich and all your kids are wearing Jordans or whatever, not the families that I deal with, they're not buying any expensive stuff. They're better budgeters than most financial planners. I don't need to show them how to do a budget. I need to show them how to become more valuable so they can earn more money and give them tools, right? And so if this bill, brings in where they're going to spend a semester teaching you how to budget or how to pay your bills or whatever, well, that's great. That's like home economics or something. But at the end of the day, we have to see is how culturally sensitive are they taking some of that material and making it with Blacks or Latinos, right? And what conversations are they having? I work with a lot of school teachers from LA Unified School District, and they have no idea of money, none whatsoever. So I don't know who's going to be teaching these courses either. And so I hope it's not do as I say, not as I do kind of teachers, right? So we'll see. Maybe you and I need to reach out to the governor and say, hey, I think we can put something better together for them.
Well, they have a group that's actually doing, I think it's the Net Generational Poverty. I think that's the name of it. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. So what do you want the listeners to take away from this
take away that money is a tool to live a better quality of life. I've never seen a U-Haul behind a hearse. You're not going to take anything with you. I think that if there's a way that you want to pull your family out of living with tremendous amount of anxiety and stress about money, whether you're living paycheck to paycheck, is that you need to start thinking about how you're thinking about money and where you can use money for its highest and best use for you as a human and not into a product. So that's why when I think that if you're meeting with somebody and they start bringing out the IUL illustration after your first meeting and never really had a chance to paint the picture on that puzzle box for them to put those pieces together, then I say run, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with what I feel the industry is mostly about is basically very product driven. Some people talk about that it's about a process, not about a product. I still think it's about people. And I still think that it might be 1 or 2 generations before we can get ourselves out of poverty. But at the end of the day, if we're on the right path and we start changing the way we're thinking about money and how we use money to impact ourselves, then you're going to have a better quality of life. Because at the end of the day, 100 years from now, nobody's here. None of your kids are here. We're not here. Let's use money to just have financial dignity in our lives.
Excellent answer. Luis, you've been outstanding on this podcast, Future Wealth Builders. I hope you enjoyed this telecast. I mean, he has been outstanding. He's been dropping gems from the time he stepped onto the platform. I've been watching him from afar. I mean, he's doing some great work, well respected in the industry. He speaks the truth, which is important. So, Luis, please provide your contact information if someone listening to this podcast would like to gain your services.
Yeah, the easiest thing is if you just go to my website, which is, I've got several, but if you just go to my name, Louis Barajas, LouisBarajas.com, you'll see all my books. You'll see a lot of the coaching material that we offer for free. You'll see it. You can get a hold of me. If you send something to info, I still get a copy of it. I get it. If there's anything that we can do to help you out, I love what Dr. Wallace is doing on here. And I'm an advocate. I believe in 100% of the model that he put together. And so I just think that there's a lot that you can do for yourself. But I feel that you can speed up the process if you work with a great coach like either me or Dr. Wallace.
Future Wealth Builders. Again, this has been an outstanding podcast, and we're going to bring it back too. So we'll have a part 2, probably a part 3 as well, because I'm sure there's a lot we can get into. We haven't even scratched the surface of his knowledge and what he brings to the table. So on behalf of the New Wealth Wave podcast, my producer, Ray Haycraft, we'd like to thank Louis for coming on to the New Wealth Wave podcast. Again, as we say, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. We'll see you on the next episode of the New Wealth Wave podcast. Take care.
Thank you for joining us on the New Wealth Wave podcast, hosted by Dr. Joaquin Wallace. Our show is edited and produced by Ray Haycraft. To dive deeper into the world of financial wisdom and learn how to create your financial footprints, head to our website at www.drjwallace.com. For more updates and exclusive content, connect with us on social media by searching Dr. Joaquin Wallace. And if you have questions and comments, feel free to email us at thenewwealthwavepodcast@gmail.com. Remember, generational wealth begins with generational knowledge. And as always, thanks for listening. The content presented in this podcast is strictly for educational purposes and should not be taken as investment advice. The views and opinions expressed by our guests may not necessarily reflect those of the New Wealth Wave podcast and its host or producers. Listeners are urged to exercise discretion and judgment before making any financial or investment decisions. Always consult with a financial professional or advisor before taking any action based on the content of this podcast. If you're enjoying the New Wealth Wave podcast, we appreciate if you leave us a review. We're always open to topic suggestions and guest recommendations. Feel free to reach out to us directly with your thoughts and feedback. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the New Wealth Wave podcast.